Hello everyone that I do and do not recognize, and I'm being very chill about it. My name is Jessica. I am a developer advocate at Launch Darkly, and I'm here to talk to you about speed and safety. Very exciting. Now, ideally, that would change the next slide, but I can't see anything up there. Can you? No? We're going very meta with this, which is another pun that I've tied into the reference. So that's strange. Well, I can try and unplug it and plug it back in again. So, I mean, I can give you a little bit of a preview of what I'm about to talk about. So basically, the title kind of gives it away. We're talking about the fallacy of move fast and break things. And whilst I was preparing this talk, I looked back at, let's just present from here and use paper. Shocking. So whilst I was prepping this talk, I looked back at the talks that were at DevOps before the Great Sickening. That's one of the nicer names I'm trying to give to this horrible infectious disease that's ravaging the world. But anyway, that's cool. We're not here to talk about that. It's gone again. That's really frustrating. Anyway, back in 2018, Kelvin Henney gave a talk called Moving Slow and Mending Things. And I don't know whether or not anyone attended DevOps back in 2018. I see a few hands, and one of them is the event organizer, so that totally makes sense, sir. But essentially, so he talked about the harm that comes with rushing. So his session, as I said, was called Moving Slow and Mending Things. He brought up this recurring conversation that he had with this engineer. It was in that tweet that came up really briefly, but essentially it was like kind of chronicling a discussion that seemed to happen again and again and again. And it was, I've got a copy of it here. It said, I can't get this code working. Did you check it before integrating it? Yes, I checked it in the interpreter. Did it work there? No. Great, excellent, excellent. And although his story was to illustrate the observation that sometimes as engineers, we have a certain optimism. His point was that you wouldn't be an engineer if you weren't optimistic. And of course, the idea of checking something in an interpreter and it not working, it makes sense when you're kind of using your rational brain, but sometimes if you're in a company, the deadlines are stacked against you out of sheer drive in good faith, desperation, for being honest. You can sometimes cross your fingers and hope for the best, and that's not really the best way to go. So it kind of trades in the whole, it works on my machine, to the terribly optimistic, it doesn't work on my machine, but what if I try it in prod? Maybe it just might work there. So my CEO used to refer to this concept as a push and pray method, partially referencing that it required a sense of divine intervention to get the change to actually work. But yeah, this observation is kind of really outlines our obsession with speed. You know, if we didn't so sorely need something to work as soon as we stood it up in prod, then we wouldn't try all of these methods that we knew definitely wouldn't work. Hopefully, I can move into the next slide soon. If not, I mean, if not, I can just talk to you if that's okay. If that's all right. I mean, I know it's not ideal, but hey, I'm launching the presentation darkly, so it is on brand. So I think everyone knows Mark Zuckerberg popularized the phrase moving fast and breaking things. And everyone decided that that was suddenly a really good idea, a good thing to do. Now, obviously, Facebook very publicly walked back this phrase. They walked back the idea of moving fast and breaking things as they rose from being what they thought was a plucky startup to becoming a household trusted name, who needed to convince governments not to break them up. But the problem is that they really validated the thinking. They proved that it could work, and then that became the blueprint for everyone. Once in effect, this model was seen to succeed, right? So this sense of harder, better, faster, stronger, sacrificing everything for pace, echoed its way down from external influence, from your funding, from external partners, into the engineering and then into your day-to-day decisions. And done wasn't really good enough. That thing that you were working on, it needed to be finished last week and iterated on yesterday. I think quite a few people might have felt that, maybe. I'm going to see if I can... Look at me pushing to prod live on stage, seeing if this is going to work. I don't think so, because I would have to see... No? Okay, well, I mean... Well, okay, well, I was going to ask later in the presentation if anyone had ever experienced anything going wrong, and for this to be a nice little point for us to bond. But as you can see, mine is now. Does anyone have any examples of things going wrong, breaking prod, that they'd like to share? You can mull it over, and I've got a T-shirt for anyone brave enough to share a story. If not, you can tweet me later, and I promise definitely not to read. Oh, there's a hand up. Hi, what happened? Mm-hmm. Ah. How did you roll that back? Could you? Okay. I'm sorry, that sounds... Well, I have a T-shirt for you at the end too. I would throw it out, but that's a little bit aggressive for this sort of conference, really, is it? Thank you for sharing something going wrong. I suddenly feel a lot less alone. I was going to show a quote from a company called Starsky Robotics. Now, they're an autonomous vehicle startup, and they thought that timing was everything for them. So they needed to be the first, and early existence was actually their edge. And I have slides. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, okay, right. So timing, more than anything else, is what I think is to... What is that saying? The most important factor in comedy is timing? No, it's repetition. No, it's timing. It's timing. So yeah, existence was their early edge, and essentially this company was... they were riding a hype cycle that they created, and when they couldn't keep up with their own velocity, they fell. To kind of really drive this point home, his CEO and prominent speaker, Jeff Lerner, you might be familiar with some of his works, here he adds that when everything is moving so rapidly, simply being fast isn't enough. You've used relentless acceleration to get where you are. You kind of need to keep that speed, right? And the only other thing that increases when you're in a startup is, along with hopefully funding and scale, is accountability. And then suddenly you're tied to this pace for the rest of your career. So once you validate this approach through actually delivering on your aims, you're kind of tied to that. And even on a purely operational level, the Dora report confirms that speed is indeed everything. These figures are from the latest iteration of the report that came out about like a month and a half ago. So yeah, they're for 2021, which is ridiculous, right? Nearly 1,000 more code deployments. When you glance at these figures, it seems like they're built by 10Xers, these companies that succeed, and they're running at an impossible rate. But I wanted to quickly pause here and kind of define what we mean by elite performers. It's become this term that crops up in pretty much every report on DevOps, right? And yeah, an elite performer... Well, so in this year's survey, elite performers made up around 26% of the report, so, or the respondents to the report. So it kind of really does drill into their workings. And an elite performer, well, here's a company that deploys multiple times per day, but the standout metric is their lead time for changes, and that's from the changes that you commit to them being live in your production build. And that time is less than an hour to go from committed code to the same change being live in production. And it's feasible when you're kind of working on your own, right? Like, you can just push it, it's fine, it's up within an hour. But that's gone up from back in 2019, when the same report was produced, that was half a day. So we've gone from half a day to half an hour pretty much within 2 years. So these companies are running really quickly. So I had to put in a GIF, I'm sorry. I couldn't help it. So in the past, I've worked for a company that it was constantly shifting gears. It felt like our priorities were changing on the hour. And when a bunch of us got together, our courage to ask for a sense of overarching strategy, we're told that we're in the phase of throwing things at the wall and seeing what stuck. Which is, really awesome and really, really reassuring. But the problem here is that I think this is a point that Kelvin pointed out. There should be another delta there, I think. It's been a long time since I studied physics. But Kelvin's talk sent me down this sort of physics wormhole. And he really explicitly pointed out that when we're talking about speed, we're talking about scalar quantity. And that's all well and good. It's great to be able to move fast, but it's kind of like the Gartner measure of the most secure companies. I don't know whether or not you've delved into those figures, but these companies get measured on how much they actually spend on security measures. That's great, right? You could spend loads on something and not actually do anything, right? Whereas here, this kind of figure, including the displacement value, it shows that you have a destination that you're driving towards. So, one of my favourite lines in the new Marvel movie, not the Eternals, no spoilers, I promise. I know that that's coming out in 2 days. But it's in Shang-Chi, is one character says to another, if you aim at nothing, you hit nothing. Love that. It's really indicative of what a lot of companies have come to have as their strategy. If you keep moving fast, you're doing something, right? You're working towards something. It feels like you're productive, but you might not necessarily be going anywhere. So the philosophy of moving fast and breaking things doesn't actually work in the long term in a lot of cases. And it can't be applied to all things, all processes, and certainly not all people. People break. But moving on from 2014 and that phrase which haunts us all, moving fast hasn't just taken hold of company decisions, right? It's taken hold of the way that we operate on a day-to-day. For better or for worse, we have hacked our attention spans and monetized them. And that means that milliseconds matter. So now we have an entire department. We've got our SRE departments, we've got platform. We've productized so many parts of the reliability function of keeping our applications standing up. Back in 2019, this study was produced, and it talked about how, let me refer to my notes really quickly. The first 5 seconds of page load times have the highest impact on conversion rates. And within those first 5 seconds, the conversion rates drop by an average of 4% with each additional second. So milliseconds really do matter. And the highest conversion rates happen when you are on a web app within that 0 to 2 seconds mark. I mean, we're talking about Facebook, right? I mean, we can attribute the rise of React as a framework to many, many things, but partially it's down to reusability. Because with every version that comes out, you don't really need to rewrite anything, and it loads really quickly. Or, I mean, does anyone dispute that? I'm sure I'll hear online if I'm very wrong. React is famous for having a very kind community. So as customers push companies push employees, and that pressure just filters all the way down. We need to stay competitive in order to survive, but these companies are built by people. And being competitive means offering all things that customers want. And when they ask for a new feature, you've got to deliver it as soon as possible, right? This is a Deloitte study on response times. It's what goes through a user's head in the first 10 seconds on a page. The results are pretty astounding, but the biggest standout was that, I think we kind of all know this now, that you're no longer competing to be in the best in your category, but you're actually competing with every digital experience that consumer has had that day. So you don't just need to be the best video on demand company and focus on your content and scaling. You need to be competing with every digital service out there. And this is changing really rapidly. We're getting better at perceiving delays. When I was looking at this year's Developer Happiness Index, quite a few things that stood out, but this quote was one of them. I don't know if anyone can identify with this. A major pain point of experience in multiple workplaces is the obsessive pursuit of a deluded understanding of an MVP. There is so much emphasis on making the building facade look impressive and moving fast, but no acknowledgement of the burning trash fire in the backyard. So in these cases, moving fast comes at the expense of actually understanding what's going on in your organization. Feedback can quickly become didactic, and we don't actually learn from our mistakes. Incidents can go ignored. And we all know what happens when you start to ignore incidents. They don't just go away. I don't know if anyone received this email back in June. A couple people maybe. Essentially, so it's not that popular over here because this went out to 44 million users of HBO Max. So it's just kind of launching, I think, in the UK. I think it's just finding its feet. I could be very wrong. I could find someone from HBO just tripping me up later on for saying that. But yeah, moving fast would be all well and good if it didn't come with drawbacks. And these are the sort of consequences that we're dealing with. This is one of the most, achingly publicly displays of breaking prod. And oh my God, that hurt looking at that. So things like burnout and high MTTR and employee turnover are the actual consequences that happen when you start running at this rate and don't actually keep up with where you're going. Now, the Carno Model, anyone who's worked in product will be super familiar with this. It's developed by Professor Carno back in the 80s, who grouped user behavior into 5 key categories. But as we all know, that must be category. It's kind of perceived as neutral. If you don't have the basic components of your application always running, you don't necessarily win favors with people. You don't get, I think as DevOps professionals, we all don't know that you don't necessarily get cheered on for keeping things running as usual. That's just the minimum expectation. And as humans, we remember pain, we're hardwired. So, if that wasn't bad enough, our brains are, through evolutionary psychology, have been hardwired to remember the most unpleasant experiences. So that one small criticism point that you heard years ago, it still sticks in your head, but those 5 things that you heard over lunch that could have been pretty complimentary, they kind of wash away because fire hot, let's not burn ourselves. If we step back into the DORA report, okay, yes, we've got this incredible, this is the sort of half an hour figure we were talking about before, the faster lead time from commit to deploy. Yes, this is incredibly fast, but this is not a typo. The faster you run, the faster you can pick up, and that is because the change rate of these companies is so low. The change failure rate of these companies is so low. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just a little bit parched. I'm just going to grab a bit of water and give you a preview of a smartphone so you can feel at home. This is stepping back to the HBO incident. So whilst at the time that engineer was probably hating their life for sending out that integration test email to absolutely everyone, on some level, everyone could kind of relate. HugOp started trending internationally, and people could just really see where they were coming from. Again, let's talk about failure really quickly. That was a point when I was actually going to ask throughout the T-shirt. It was going to be a whole thing. We're all going to get to know each other. It's going to be great. Skip into the next session. But unfortunately, I failed, so that's okay. But it's really good to reframe failure, right? It's a learning point. I committed a lot of terrible sins when I was a junior dev. And it made me really obsessed with the world of DevSecOps. And I'm sure after that destroy happened, that changed the way that you functioned, right, with your company. Sorry, I'm flailing a little bit because this bit was unrehearsed. Yes, I'd love one. Dylan?
We could literally replace the homepage with I love LAMP, and I saved it, then realized I was remoted into production when I did it.
Oh.
Yeah, and it was so, like, it was such a spectacular failure. Everyone assumed it must be something they'd done wrong. Like, told us and went, your website says I love lamp and all the pages have gone. Because why would you report that? Clearly that's not
It must be me. I'm
that was the, like, we really shouldn't be allowed to remote into production. Like, no matter how bad the emergency, you should not have remote desktop onto a production web server.
Did that change the way I was going to say? Did that put an end to remote?
It
Yeah.
was an objective to work towards.
Okay.
So how do we still fix things without having to be like, you know what? Because we got to this culture when something broke, you'd be like, right, we'll fix it on live and then we'll push live back into revision control.
Mm-hmm.
This is back in the dark days of classic ASP and subversion. And that was, you know, when there was an incident, you'd fix it on live because that was the fastest place to get fixed.
Yes, exactly. Because
Feedback loop. And then, if you knew what you were doing, you'd remember to push that back into revision control. And if you didn't, you'd forget, and next time you deployed, you'd break the same thing again. Yeah, it took us a little while to move beyond that.
this is the thing with swords. Like, why do they have two edges? Why? It's not helpful. Yes, I can fix it quickly, but I can also break it quickly. No. This whole kind of idea of reframing failure, it's kind of... Kelvin sent me down a whole physics rabbit hole, as I said, and it was wonderful, terrible for my sleep pattern, but excellent for getting involved in expanding out this talk a little bit better. But what is a wave if not a transfer of energy, right? And we all know that development time, it requires energy from somewhere, deeper than us. But if we kind of step back and frame errors as a start towards success, then it puts everything else into context, right? So let's stop for a moment and quickly talk about finishing things. Don't worry, this is not a call out. This next slide is not going to have all of your names with your expired domains for your side projects on it. I'm not here to call anyone out. But this is definitely a safe space. But I just wanted to draw attention to, this is another thing that Kelvin brought up in his talk, and I feel like this is my first point where I'm going to disagree with him. So he brought up an excellent quote by Neil Gaiman: you have to finish things. That's where you learn from. That's what you learn from. You learn by finishing things. I love this point, but his overarching kind of idea here is that, yeah, it's good to finish something, right? Because it causes you to pause and think, was that good? Was that bad? Was it a success? Was it a failure? But the thing is that finishing things can be really scary. It's terrifying because when you call something finished, that's it. It's out into the wild and you are judged by that thing. And yeah, of course, it's great to change our relationship to the word finished and to kind of become more accustomed to that level of uncomfortability. But we know from user design that we need to be a little bit more realistic with ourselves and not maybe change us, but change maybe the frameworks that we're working within, right? So things can be a work in progress, right, and still exist. Maybe if we change the way that we look at finished. Okay, I've broken a presentation rule. I've had 2 XKCD comics in this. I'm sorry. I know that's too many. But has anyone in this room ever procrastinated? No. Okay, maybe I was telling the truth, but maybe I was lying. This is a horrible talk full of call-outs and tagging. But yeah, procrastination, as we know, often occurs for one of 2 reasons, but it's usually when the logical side and the emotional side of our brains are out of sync with each other. As creatures, we hate fear, and it can paralyze us and cause us to run. Basic fight or flight. Fight or flight? Nearly said that correctly. Full of failures, this talk, honestly. It's ridiculous. Yeah, pushing to prod, it kind of, if it becomes a scary process where we can actually break all of the life changes, as Dylan said, it elicits the secretion of cortisol, and that's a thoroughly enjoyable experience for us all. But the emotional side of our brain, it wants to keep us comfortable. It craves rewards, and it shields us from pain. But the rational side of us, that's where the sort of paralysis by analysis comes into effect. And how can we combat this? We can lower the stakes. We can phase our releases. We can deconstruct features, breaking things down, take apart monolithic shaped problems, and that helps us to remind ourselves what the stakes actually are here. I mean, yeah, they're high, but like, it's one step. Just marathon. It's made up of many little steps. It's just putting one foot in front of the other, right? It can't be that hard. So congratulations, this is the 1,000th time you are seeing this diagram. So when we talk about CI, we're often talking about code, but code is just a set of instructions. Yeah, they're disseminated by a program, but it's a set of instructions, and an architecture layer it's an order of operations. This is communication. And if we can borrow terms from construction, social psychology, physics, and apply them to engineering, then why can't we do that the other way around? Why can't we take CI principles and apply them to other areas of the business to help us to keep things moving and give us that pausing point for iteration? So organizations, just as Nigel Kirsten says, so one of my first talks in real life, other than seeing Dylan, who is also speaking at this conference, was seeing Nigel Kirsten, and he presented his State of DevOps 2021 report, and he made the excellent observation that it's just people all the way down. Teams, companies are just teams of people. We're all just users. It's people all the way down. It's terribly easy to forget that we're creating software for people and by people, and we can really lose ourselves in the term user. But the other important thing that he mentioned was that orders of magnitude really matter. So things don't go up by an order of 1 every time. I don't know whether or not you've noticed that with requirement values, but when you kind of add another 10 requirements, you've got an order of magnitude of 10 on top of that, because you're not just talking about the dissemination of information, right? You're talking about interpreting that, sharing that, distributing it. One of the things that he found in his report is that the best performing teams don't just work to collaborate, but they define the types and the orders of the interactions that they have. And that may sound like an overthinking point, but if you remove all of the cognitive load of performing an action, and instead of someone having to think, okay, do I ask this Slack channel to fill out this form? If you define the realms in which you're communicating, people are free to get things done. This is platform engineering, but we're applying it to working with individuals, and it's an excellent way of doing things. Incidents. Horrible, right? This talk does actually include quite a lot of pain, doesn't it? I was really just let the pandemic get to me when I put this together, I think. But incidents, I mean, they're tough, unexpected, but if we had to take the Netflix approach of chaos engineering, incidents, they're the catalyst for learning. If we stop using incidents if we stop treating them as the issue that's gone wrong, but instead highlight them as the error of the process at hand, then we can hopefully unite as teams around them and become better. So I'm sure most people have read Accelerate in this room, super popular book. But in Accelerate, Nicole Forsgren talks about changing culture, and culture often, it gets looked at as this really fuzzy thing. In previous DORA reports, low-performing teams have often blamed culture for what goes wrong in their organization, right? Because it's really easy to blame things on people, because people are complex, they're tough to understand, we've got all of these jagged edges. But if we step back and we actually delve into that really tough subject of culture and look at how we can change it, we can start treating human error as our node and go from there. So how can you change your culture to create better products? So Blameless Culture is part of that. So we really need to work to instill a blameless culture. Sorry. This whole order has thrown me off a little bit, but essentially, okay, if you look to attribute human error, you're assigning blame, and the idea of instilling a blameless culture so you can get to psychological safety. That's a real real goal here. So psychological safety, it gives the ability for people to show up to work without fear of consequences. They know consequences are going to happen, but they're not afraid of them. That's a really important bit. So employees, they need to feel empowered to speak up. In Dylan's example, no one spoke up when they saw the I Love Lamp site because they kind of thought, oh gosh, is it me? And I don't know whether or not this was to do with the lack of psychological safety in an organisation, because I've called people out enough in this talk, and I'm not going to keep on doing it because then I will lose everyone around me that I call friends. But if you have psychological safety, then you have the freedom to be able to point out what you think is wrong, unite around the problem, and move on. And instead of asking why, try asking what or how. We need to keep that mindset that we are designing for the real users that we have in the room, and not necessarily trying to blame ourselves and improve ourselves and hold ourselves to impossible standards. Sometimes asking why can cause people to jut into a defensive mode. And yes, maybe that's wrong, but that's not their fault. It's completely understandable. Maybe ask how. If we words matter, and if we change the words that we use and when we use them, if we alter our lexicon, we can kind of go a bit further when it comes to incident retrieval. So this is another highlight from the DORA report, is the more a team employs SRE practices, the less likely its members are to experience burnout. Engineering decisions, they have real human implications beyond changing a UI. And here's an example of, I know I've got my own company there, please excuse me, I'm sorry. But this is, when you let people choose their own tooling, focus on the tools to solve the human errors, then you can find that you work together as a better team, and you're able to instill confidence in your build. So, I'm just catching up on my notes. I think we're doing okay for time. So this is where I get a bit practical. So how do we do this practically? So progressive delivery, testing in production. I was at an event last week when we were talking about a production environment. There is no production like production. You can work to increase staging and change staging and be really rigid about how you look at things, but at the end of the day, you've got to get into production, right? And targeted rollouts to see how things actually perform under stress. But things are going to actually break, and that's where you've got to be able to talk about having recovery methods in place. So kill switches, serve metrics, and safe migrations. So here is an example of how we did this at Launch Darkly. So just going to push past experimentation. But at Launch Darkly, we wanted to figure out how dependent we were on Elasticsearch, and it turns out very. The version that we're working on was getting deprecated pretty quickly, so we decided to stage our migration using feature flags. We're big fans of using our own product and making sure that we're using what we're creating, because then you can actually be sure that you actually like the thing you put into the wild. But by staging our migration of Elasticsearch, we were able to kind of test its performance using actual production data. It meant that everything stayed accurate, and within a really tight period of time, we were able to migrate to the new version of Elasticsearch. So now we're towards the actual final element. So the final piece of this puzzle, and to me the most important, is people. So you need to have people who are willing to communicate, right? You need to have empathy. You need to be able to understand the tools and the processes that have been put in place, and most importantly, why they've been put in place. But you need people to empower your people to be able to speak up and share when things aren't going well. If people aren't willing to follow the process that you've put in place to secure safety and speed, then the result will end in more failures. So just to sum up, creating a culture of experimentation and psychological safety will actually produce tangible results. Recognize your biases and design for the people that you actually are, instead of judging your employees and trying to push them to change. Plan ahead and empower your teams and communicate. And failure does actually lead to growth. You can form calluses. Now, a talk is nothing without actual resources that you can take away, so I'll send these out afterwards. These are starters for 10, but ensure everything is connected. Just keep that in mind when you're working with your teams. And I mean that kind of like this. Not like this, but like maybe like this in the middle somewhere. So yeah, only by being realistic, you can prevent dumpster fires. You can present dumpster fires like I have today. Well, thanks very much. I've been Jessica Cregg, and thank you for bearing with me. Cheers. Thank you. Should I step down? Have we got any questions, or should I give the next person a little bit of time? Awesome. Cool. Well, let's chat. I'm on the internet, so yeah, hit me up on Twitter and let's talk. See you soon. Have a great DevOps. And thank you for bearing with me.